Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Sprint 66 review. Let's get started. All right, today I'll start with the Sprint statistics, and I'll also be doing architecture. David today will be doing the classic UI, Chris K on the service UI, Bronagh will pick up providers, Tina doing automate, GT on the platform, and Alberto on API, and finishing up with Chris on documentation. Before we go to the next slide, wanted to announce that Find 3 has been released. We don't have a slide for it, but it was released this week. So go check it out, download it on ManageIQ.org, and let us know how it's working. Next slide, please. For the repo stats, we had 462 closed PRs with 98 in ManageIQ, 83 in the UI Classic, and the rest sprinkled out, as you can see. We got 2 new repos this sprint. Joe Raffanello worked on extracting the REST API into its own repo. So we have the ManageIQ API repo, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And Bill Way created a new gem in the ManageIQ messaging repo. That is the new abstraction layer over the ActiveMQ Artemis queue. And ideally, what we want to do is create a have it point to the old MIQ queue and the new queue, but right now it only points to the new queue. And I'll talk about that a little more as well. Next slide, please. Sprint breakdown, 38% enhancements, 25% bugs. So we got a pretty decent split. The rest kind of smattering all over the place. So this is pretty typical. Next slide, please. For the PRs merged per sprint, we are at 462, so a little bit higher than last sprint. One thing I think I'd like to do in the future with this chart is change the y-axis a little bit, because it makes it look like we had no PRs last sprint when we had 411. So I think it's a little misleading. But we seem to be going back into the normal trend. Let's see where it takes us in the future sprints. Next slide, please. For the health report, everything is pretty stable. One standout is the Lenovo repo dropped from a 4.0 to a 3.09. I started researching this right before the meeting, but couldn't figure out what changed. So I'll probably be looking at this once we're done with the sprint review and trying to understand what happened there. Typically when this happens, it's usually something in a global setting changed and it changes the entire repo, but I would have expected adjustments across the board if that happened. So not really sure, but we'll take a look. Next slide, please. Okay, for architecture, we had on the Kubernetes side of things, we had a number of changes for the G release. The one change by Nick Carboni was the Foreman proc file. What this is there's a gem called Foreman, not to be confused with the project called the Foreman. What Foreman does is you create a proc file which defines different processes that you want to run, and you say Foreman start, and it'll start all of those processes at the same time. And when you control C out of it, they'll bring them all down at the same time. And this is really useful for development where you may only want to run 1 or 2 workers, maybe a UI and a generic worker, and that's it. And we're kind of hoping that this file will get away from the old MIQ Spartan mode and people having to run rake EVM start on their machines. And it uses the same command lines that we use in our container efforts. So hopefully it'll mirror the process for local development. That's already been merged and it's will be in the G release, but it's mostly for developers. Next, as I said earlier, Joe Raffanello extracted the ManageIQ REST API into its own repo. That has been completed, and the REST API team has now moved over to the new repo. And part of the rationale behind that, from the architecture side of things, is Joe is looking at trying to improve memory, the memory footprint. And he found that by extracting the API, he could save about 8 to 9 meg per process. If you multiply that by the number of workers that we have, that's quite a bit. So it was a really good find. Next, Gregg T worked on these server worker message passing. So when a server talks to a worker and tells it what kind of work to do, one of the things it does is it'll give it messages like, hey, update your roles, update your config. And Gregg simplified that to just say, update all the things. And it'll just it'll check and see if, oh, okay, roles, config, all the other stuff. So it makes the message passing simpler. And once it's simpler, he has a follow-up PR to get rid of the server worker communication altogether. And we might just do it with memcache or etcd, where we just say, something has changed, go update it. And so the simplified message passing is in master. Finally, one more small thing, LJ decoupled some things that we had from the VMware Web Service gem and set them to delay load. So we don't actually need the VMware Web Service gem running all the time. So that was another way of getting the memory footprint smaller for providers that don't need them. Run more workers as individual deployments in OpenShift. This is not in the G release. This is for the future stuff. Nick Carboni has been working on trying to make smaller and smaller containers, and he got about 6 or 7 different worker types running as individual containers at this point, and he's going to continue on with the provider-specific workers next. And finally, Brandon got OpenShift installed on a VM in our lab. He was going through a lot of struggles with it, but he finally got it working, and we've actually been playing around with it and running apps on there, and it seems to be working okay. On the MIQQ side of things, as I said earlier, Bill created the ManageIQ messaging gem. Right now, the only backend for it is the ActiveMQ Artemis backend using Stomp. I know they've been looking at Cupid Proton and also a backend for talking to our old queue, but those are still in the works. Madhu and Keenan worked on getting a spreadsheet detailing the edge case usage of the MIQQ. This is places where we're using weird features of our own MIQQ, and those are probably not portable over to ActiveMQ Artemis. So we may go for a time being leaving those talking to the old queue until we can figure out how to reinvent them to go over the new queue. But the spreadsheet was created and put out, and now we have it documented, and I think that will sort of wrap up the work on the queue, at least for the rearch spike that we're doing. Finally, Keenan has moved over to writing a metrics persister via ActiveMQ Artemis. We're taking the metrics thing and splitting it into the collector persister kind of split like we've done with the inventory and the events. So he's looking at writing the metrics persister, and Adam's looking at writing the metrics collector. So next slide, please. Well, I jumped ahead of myself. That's okay. On the inventory side of things, Halasz has been working on batch disconnect for inventory containers, and that'll be on master. That is during the collection when something gets deleted, we set the deleted on flag, and he's trying to do this in a batch way to increase performance. And finally, Adam worked on a microservice for VM operations. He wanted to see what it would take to essentially get rid of the broker entirely and instead create a microservice where you would just tell it, say, for this VM, do a stop, and it would do it on your behalf, which does the same effect as a connection broker. That worked out pretty well. It was using Sinatra and RBVMOMI under the covers, and we're going to continue investigating that in the coming sprint. And finally, on the metrics side, a couple of directions we've gone. Gregg B and myself worked on a detailed document of the metrics usages, trying to understand how we actually use the metrics in our product from the consumer side, and if any of those features can be thrown away, if they're still useful. We're going to do a deeper analysis of what's in that document and try to figure out, do we need these things? If we can get rid of them, that may change the way we use the metrics, which may impact the way we actually change the metrics backend. Adam worked on, this is what I was mentioning before, the collection side of things. So instead of doing a one-by-one collection of metrics, he did a prototype to just batch collect, say, all 10,000 VMs worth of metrics at once, and then writing it to an Artemis queue. And then on the other side, Keenan's looking at pulling that off the queue and persisting it to the database. And we're trying to see if that will improve the scalability and performance of the metrics collection itself. During this work, Adam found that for VMware metrics, we are doing a lot of extraneous calls. because we're going one by one, and a lot of it isn't necessary. So for Goprindashvili, he's trying to look at seeing if he can get less calls over to VMware and what kind of performance improvements that'll improve. And I'm not sure if he made PRs for those yet, but if not, they will definitely be made for the next sprint. Also, Nick Lamoro found some places during the collection, or the processing, I should say, where we're using way too many objects when we process the metrics. And so he has a PR out there right now, not merged yet, that will reduce the number of objects during the processing of those metrics. And finally, Chris Arkan worked on writing an active metrics adapter for our existing Postgres tables, and that has actually been implemented for G. That is when you process the metrics, that will actually get written to the table via active metrics. What's cool about that is you can switch the backend by just changing where active metrics is pointing to. So we can write to Elasticsearch or Influx or wherever we'd like. And this is the beginning of starting to move us toward the abstraction layer. And I believe that's it. Next slide, please.
So hi, everyone. On the UI front, we merged 71 PRs. As you see, almost the same amounts of enhancements as bug fixes. And we are also growing the number of PRs in the UI components. On the refactoring side, we cleaned up how we are handling the toolbar button methods. On the trees, we have been still using the old CFME no-click attribute and Dynatree compatible attributes such as children. We renamed them to the new API, and we moved some code to the core repo that should be in the core repo, concretely the dialog import service, as it's only called during seeding. On the technical debt side, our interns are cleaning up the UI constants, deleting the unnecessary ones. And we also cleaned up a bit the expression editors, and there are some new decorators for icons. So we could delete some old icon helper with statically defined icons in the application controller. On the enhancements, we worked on the generic objects UI, added a way to pick your custom font icons for custom buttons. Also, you could pick your colors for those icons. And also for the custom buttons, we enabled the visibility expression. That means that if you set something in an expression editor related to the button, it will only show for that kind of expression, if that kind of expression is true. Next slide, please. Here you see the custom button editor. Instead of the 8 or 10, I don't really remember, preset custom icons, now you can use an icon picker, and you can also use a color picker. So now you have like a billion of possible icon and color combination. Next slide, please. Here is how it looks, the icon picker. You basically have the possible font icons, divided to tabs based on the icon classes. You just pick one and it throws you back to the custom button select page. That's all for me. Next slide, please. Sorry. And here you can see the expression editor for the custom button editor. That's all. Next slide.
Thanks, David. So a couple quick stats on our sprint. We've completed 12 stories. 7 of those were features, 2 of those were bugs, and 7 of those were chores. You can kind of see the breakdown. Lots of work went into my services snapshots and the dialogues. Next slide, please. The biggest feature now that we've included in the service UI is the snapshot timeline. So you can see from a very easy graphical way of when your snapshots got taken, both from a date and a time perspective. And you can zoom in and zoom out as you need, instead of having to search through a list. Next slide, please. A couple other features that we added the font fabulous icons, and which now brings us to support the icon editor, which was included in the operations UI. We migrated the dialog viewer from the service UI repo into the UI components repo, did a whole bunch of bug fixes and cleanups on that, and it'll and we've then re-included it back into the self-service UI. We also moved the ACE editor component over to the UI components. As far as bugs, we fixed a few UI component issues that popped up with the dialogues, and we fixed an issue with the service UI not properly displaying the retired status. As far as chores goes, we updated our dependencies as usual. We brought our test coverage up by about 5%, and we added that timeline viewer, which is now included with the snapshots, back to the Angular Patternfly repo for everyone else to use. And that's it for us. Next slide, please.
All right, so I'm going to share highlights from 4 provider repos. That's Azure, OpenStack, Rev, and Lenovo, as well as updates from the provider's core. Next slide, please. The most merged pull requests this sprint came from the Kubernetes repo, followed jointly by VMware and Azure, and then Lenovo and OpenShift. Next slide, please. So Daniel refactored some of the Azure discovery code, and so we're seeing a 40 to 50% reduction in memory consumption and a 2x improvement in real time. And then for Rev, a memory allocation limit can now be set during virtual machine provisioning. Next slide, please. And for OpenStack, flavors can now be created and deleted. And for Lenovo, refresh discovery support was added this spring. Next slide, please. And for Provider's Core, some work was done this sprint on graph refresh, error logging enhancements, and support for a batch disconnect, which is a soft deletion of virtual machines, and also some performance improvements on batch saving. And Lattice Lab has an open pull request that will make even further performance improvements to batch saving. And once that's merged, I should be able to share some numbers that will illustrate how great these performance improvements are. And so a new refresh method was added, which can be called from Automate. And it will call a targeted refresh if configured. Otherwise, it will call a full refresh. Next slide, please. Over to Tina.
Yes, good morning. Okay, so Automate had 32 PRs merged this sprint, 11 enhancements, 13 bugs, and 8 refactoring. On the enhancement front, Madhu added an MIQ expression method, which is really cool. It's a new type of Automate method that allows you to use advanced search filters as an Automate method. One advantage is that it runs directly in the worker rather than forking the DRB process. The Rev team added events for refreshing new target and change the interval. Basically, they added enhanced event handling for import, which has a more efficient refresh, more accurate import status, and they adjusted the retry interval from 30 minutes to 3 minutes. As ongoing work for generic objects, service relationships were added to generic objects. Next slide, please. Okay, a few provisioning bugs I'd like to talk about. We recently discovered that the generic service state machine retry interval was not specified, which means that a retry for the Ansible playbooks would be put on the queue, and the retry would happen immediately. The good news is it's a one-line method fix that could be made locally. Added logging for full provider messages. Sometimes during provisioning, when the execute phase of provisioning has a failure, it's difficult to determine if the failure is on the Automate side or the provider side. So a new logging was added to display the full provider message, which makes it easier to determine where the error actually came from. And finally, resolved an issue for users with multiple groups. So what happens, a user group can change from the time a user orders provisions a request until the time the request is complete. So what happens is there's a change that was made that sets the user's group back to the requester group so that provision object has proper ownership. This is a problem in the SUI, because in the ops UI, the user's current group is updated in a database when the user switches groups, and the SUI it is not. And that's it for Automate. Next slide, please.
All right. On the platform side, we had pretty much even enhancements and bugs and then some smattering of other things. So I'll just talk about the highlights of those. So for enhancements for the G release, started working on the back end for custom buttons so that we can support expressions that control whether a button is visible and also whether it's, if it is visible, whether it's enabled or disabled. That should add a lot of flexibility. On the RBAC side, work has gotten underway for supporting also expressions in entitlements. It's pretty rigid what you have today because for the filtering part, you get to pick tags, and there's some built-in logic there where, you know, when it's within the same category, it's an and across categories it's an or. It might be flipped, don't quote me on that, but it's pretty rigid. So with expressions, you can basically build an expression however you want. With tags, have ands, ors, and other multiple atoms if needed. And that you can never have enough atoms. Okay. Also, Libor added host aggregates class to RBAC as well. And I should just mention that the Libor did the custom buttons backend for expressions, and Tim is working on the entitlement part of it. And then Jillian started doing some work on rolling up metrics at the service level. So for the service UI, they'll be able to start presenting metrics on services. The next step there is to add metrics at the service level to the API. And Joe Raffanello added megabytes memory usage to the rake EVM status and status full. He had previously done that for the workers. Now you get to see it on the server as well. And some bug fixes. A couple of important ones here. On the reporting side, you already fixed a bug that was preventing reports from downloading at all. So it's pretty serious. And one that I think had been around for quite some time, where when you downloaded a report, it was cut off at 80 characters. So that's been fixed. And Joe V did a bug fix on for external authentication matching, where we do a case-insensitive match on the user. Before this change, basically when the user got created in the way it was typed in when you logged in, and you had to type it in that case in order for it to match. That's a pretty big change as well. I think that's it for the platform. Next slide. Turn over to Alberto.
Thanks, Greg. So for the API, we had a couple of notable enhancements. First one here is by Jillian, where we are currently, we now return paging links. So if you do paging in API, which is specified with the offset and limit, here's an example, getting VMs limiting to 10 and not starting with offset 50. The things that are in italic here are the added things. So you'll notice the pages count right under set count, and then a new links section on the bottom, which kind of gives the caller reference to where he is with respect to self, the current page, the first, last, and next pages, which kind of helps, easy browsing the pages. Before, the caller had to keep track of limit and offset, and kind of if you don't get that limit come back, that means you're at the last page. Well, this gives you a better handle of the whole set. So great work by Jillian. So next slide, please. Okay, so one enhancement by Tim. So earlier we had enhanced the API so that all IDs, as you see in this example, ID and host ID are returned in compressed form. This was to enable clients that can handle large integers to work here with strings. So this enhancements was so that we also return or build the href accordingly. Because before, the href was still with the uncompressed ID, even though it was a string, but at least now it's consistent. The IDs and hosts that you returned. Next slide, please. Yep, so as Jason mentioned, the REST API is now in its own repo. A lot of work from Joe R. You notice here the repos ManageIQ-API, and there was also a talk article which mentions this, and also a link to information if you had PRs in the old repo, how to move to the new repo, and all that goodness. Yeah, great work, a lot of work from Joe R. Thank you, Joe. And that's it for the API. Next slide, please.
Hi, for documentation in the last sprint, we had a total of 16 merged pull requests, 13 of which were enhancements, 3 of which were bug fixes. Some highlights there, we have added a procedure to create container template catalog items. We've updated sections on updating appliances and container image instructions. Further instruction was provided for Rev provider snapshot support. We added some links to the Red Hat container catalog, and we have instructions on creating a generic catalog item. In the last call, I was asked about the publication process and whether or not it's automated. And I checked with the DPM, Andrew Doms, and it is manual at the moment. So anything that's basically not a forthcoming release, we can go in and publish to existing documentation on our own. That's it. Thanks.
All right. So thanks for listening to the Sprint 66 review. The next review will be on August 23rd. And I don't see any questions in the chat. Do we have any on the phone? Not? Have a great day. Thanks, everyone.